Hello, everybody. There's seats in the front on both sides. Come on in. First of all, welcome here on a Friday night. There's a dance over in the gym over here. Is everybody in the right place? We're in the right place. Okay, good. There's also a football game. It's really amazing that you're all here tonight for this show. I want to welcome you. I'm Andy Gilman, and I'm part of the Ojai Chautauqua. We are having a bit of a departure tonight from the usual form, and that is, instead of having a panel on a sort of controversial, complicated subject, we are having two people. One is Dan Schnurr, who many of you know, who's been our moderator and collaborator, and Cecilia Black, his wife, who helps us put these panels together. And we have Warren Olney, who you know, and that's why you're here, from KCRW and NPR. Yes? So we don't have much time with them, so I'm going to have them start right away. But I do want to say that you have a packet on your chair, and I'm going to talk about that after they're done. But first I want to give the warmest welcome to Dan Schnurr and Warren Olney.
I know what this is.
You've used one of those before?
I have, yeah.
Listen, Andy, thank you very much for the very, very kind introduction. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us here tonight. As I've told Warren, I have the great privilege of participating in a number of the Chautauquas that this community's hosted. And as I've told him and many, many other people, I think what you do here is not just impressive, not just extraordinary, but the fact that this community can come together the way you do for conversations like the ones we've had together, I think sets an example. It sets an example for communities across California and across the country. And it's a type of dialogue that's missing all too much in the country today. So before we get the opportunity to listen to Warren, my friend Warren, without our usual constraints, I'd ask you to do this. While Warren and I very much appreciate the applause you gave us, I'd ask first that you join us in thanking our host committee, the Wachtels, the Krauses, and the number of community leaders who put these programs together. We're very, very grateful to all of you, so let's please give them a round of applause.
Could I quickly just say something? I share what Dan said very much. It seems to me that this kind of forum and this kind of civic participation is exactly what we need. It's not the town hall of the days of the pioneers, but it is a wonderful forward representation of that. And so I would congratulate you all for being here, and for those of you who have put it together too. I'll give you a round of applause.
And because I know there was a little bit of confusion about whether you were supposed to applaud yourselves or not, let me eliminate that confusion. For all of you gathered for these conversations tonight and through the years we've worked together, you as a community are setting an example. So please, give yourselves a much heartier and deserved round of applause. So, like all of you, I've been an admirer of Warren Olney's for many years. And one of the great privileges, at least for me, that comes with age and if nothing else, just persistence, is after many, many years of being a fan of his over the airwaves, I've had the chance to get to know Warren. And I will tell you this, as impressive as he was on television, as extraordinary as he's been over the years on radio, he's even more extraordinary in person, and I promise you, you're in for a real treat tonight.
Now I have to live up to that, please.
Now I have to lower expectations. Exactly.
Well, let me just say, Dan has been a guest on our show, too, many, many times. And the wonderful thing about him is that producers call the guests in advance and set them up so that I don't wear out the welcome. And he's one of the guests that we have that always says the same thing to me that he said to the producer over the phone, which I really appreciate. There's a consistency about that, which a lot of people don't have,
So the key to getting invited on Warren's show is only having one thought to offer. and offering it over and over and over again. I've just.
And don't try to get us too.
Well, look, I think, as Andy referenced, I think the really neat thing about tonight's program is while I think we all really value the Chautauquas and the panels that we've had together in the past, where we have 4 or 5 really smart, impressive people talking about a topic, as Andy mentioned, from a variety of different perspectives. Tonight is a little bit different for a couple reasons. One, instead of having that broad range of perspectives, what Warren and I'll hope to do over the course of the next 90 minutes is offer not advocacy on behalf of a particular issue or cause or party or candidate, but rather offer perspective and hopefully some analysis that can be of some benefit to you as you watch the news as it unfolds in these very, very unique and challenging times. And the other thing that I think, for those of you who've listened to Warren's show over the years, as I have, that you'll especially enjoy, is Warren, we've all agreed, is the absolute master at asking questions, but tonight he's going to have to answer some too. And so that's going to be a lot of fun as well. So with that, I'm going to start, and then as we've always done in the past, in a little while, I'll remind all of you once again why you have blank index cards at your seat. And we'll ask you to take a little bit of time and write down a question or questions that one of us can put to the other on your behalf. But I will tell you, until then, unlike the programs we've done in the past, the questions that I will be asking, at least from my direction, are drawn almost entirely from the questions that have been submitted to us by all of you in recent weeks. And I will tell you, in preparing for this, having that kind of help from all of you has been invaluable. And I will tell you that even though we're probably not going to be able to ask every single one of your questions verbatim in exactly what was phrased, know that virtually everything we talk about tonight will be drawn from the suggestions and the questions that you've offered. So thank you in advance for those. And as usual, no offense to the people of my generation in the room, as usual, the best questions, as always, are from the high school students who involve themselves in our programs. And the young men and women from Oak Grove and Ventura High School and any number of others have done themselves proud with online questions, just the way they have with questions in our previous programs. So let's get started, Warren.
Sure.
We want to talk about the political landscape. We want to talk about public policy. We want to talk about media. We've gotten a whole range of questions, but what I'd like to do is start out by taking a step back. After a very distinguished career in television, many years ago, you were asked to host a talk program called Which Way LA? And I'll articulate to the best of my abilities, and then I'll defer to you. The premise behind Which Way LA, as many people no longer remember because it's been part of our lives for such a long time, was a very direct response, if I'm not mistaken, to the LA riots and its aftermath. And it was your thought and the thought of the people with whom you worked, is that the people of Southern California, of the greater Los Angeles region, needed some venue through which they could talk to each other and listen to each other and interact with people with whom they didn't necessarily agree, but who they would benefit from hearing. So that was 20 plus years ago. And despite your extraordinary successes, let's agree that that idea of sponsoring and encouraging that conversation hasn't exactly caught on in society. And if anything, through no fault of yours or your producers, and no fault of the people who come to the Chautauqua here in Ojai, but if anything, over that 20, 25-year period, it's become much, much more difficult, much harder to get people to be willing to engage in conversation, to listen to those with whom they disagree. Why do you think that's happened?
Wow, that's a huge question. Let me just go back to the history a little bit. I had been in television for a long time, as you said, and worked for Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7, back to Channel 2 again before I got through. And I had really gotten very disillusioned with what television was doing. It wasn't doing the same things it was doing when I started out. It wasn't doing the kind of journalism that I wanted to do, although I was very lucky while I was in television. I was able to do a lot of investigative reporting and a lot of political reporting at a time when there were many more resources available than there are now. There were staffs were bigger, and there was more of an appetite for news. That began to wither away, particularly when the FCC got rid of the fairness doctrine, and it was no longer necessary to keep your license for a station to provide the alternative to a controversial point of view, which it had been in the past. The argument being that there were now so many more outlets because of cable television that that everybody would be represented, and of course that has happened. In fact, when I started out, obviously there were newspapers, and newspapers still to this day do provide more of the fundamental basic news of the day than anybody else. But at that time, the television networks had become the primary sources of news for most people, which I believe they still are. And there were only 3 of them, and basically they were telling the same stories. All of them were pretty much telling the same stories. So that led to created a situation where we all shared the same information. We all were talking about the same things. But when you have this multiplicity of sources of information, that began to divide up, and now it's divided up even more. And now we have people talking about fake news, for example, because they don't believe what somebody else is absorbing or what somebody else is putting out if they're not comfortable with it, if they don't like it. A part of the news is telling people things they don't want to know or wish they didn't have to know. And now they can choose whatever makes them comfortable. And that's apparently what they do. And so there has been this tremendous division of sources of news and audience for news as well. The audience for each particular entity is smaller than it used to be, but the number of available sources of news is much, much greater than it ever was before. Back to my career, I had quit television, as I said, and then in 1992, we had, as a result of the acquittal of the officers that were accused of beating Rodney King, we had a riot in Los Angeles, and it was the there was more property damage and more loss of life and life and property than any other civil disturbance in the 20th century in the United States, which surprised me. I covered the Washington, D.C. riots in 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed, and I also went to Newark and covered that one, although at the very end. And here we were, all those years later, in Los Angeles having the same thing. But not only, what had happened here, too, was that Tom Bradley was elected mayor. That was in 1974, or 73. 73, Tom Bradley was elected mayor. And it's widely said that he won with a coalition of Jewish and African-American voters, but it was much more than that. And Bradley recognized the diversity of Los Angeles before anybody else did, I think. And I remember very distinctly that when he had been elected, finally, he lost in a very racist campaign against Sam Yorty, the incumbent, 4 years before. But then when he was elected and he announced his staff, the people that were working for him, he not only announced their names and gender and age and previous occupation, but also their nation of origin, their religion, and he made an effort to represent the city of Los Angeles in a way that nobody had ever thought of representing it before. When Sam Yorty was mayor, it was sort of a black-white situation. Then came the Bradley administration, and I remember very distinctly that he had all these different people from different places, and it was an amazing number and amazing variety of people, one of whom, and I made this a point of my story about it, was an Episcopalian from Malta, which, so you could see he was really, making as many distinctions as he possibly could in order to show the situation. So flash forward to 1992, and we have this riot, and it was widely perceived as something like the Watts riot of 1965, which it wasn't at all. And it's kind of interesting because, I was invited to come and do one night of interviews on KCRW radio about that, not knowing that the general manager at the time, Ruth Seymour, had an idea that she might want to have an ongoing program. And so after doing one night of interviews in 1992, I'm still there. I couldn't think of anything else to do. Anyway, we wanted and set out to represent the diversity of the city because it appeared that what was responsible for the fact that there was so much violence, so much property destruction, so much anger, that there were a lot of voices that just were not being heard and hadn't been heard for a long time. And so we set out to try to bring as many people together as we possibly could who were in fact different. And not only did we bring together people of different ethnicities and different racial backgrounds and religions and so on, but also people who were in the various bureaucracies in the city and county of Los Angeles, who worked on the same issues but didn't know each other. And sometimes they would come on the program and they would tell me afterwards. I've always called every single guest after every program just to say thank you, and I always learn a lot when I do that because other hosts don't do it for some reason. But what I learned was that people were delighted that they were able to make the acquaintance, if they were working for the city, of somebody who worked for the county who was also working on the same kind of thing that they were, whether it was highways or homeless people or health care or whatever it happened to be. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we were able to do that. After a while, then, we began to realize that because of the diversity of the city, national and international news is local news in Los Angeles. And that's when we started doing To the Point, which we started actually in the year 2000, because of that very fact. And we were, as we did more stories of a greater variety, I would once again call the guests afterwards, and I would call them in Chicago or New York or Washington or wherever they were, and they would say, gee, that's a pretty good program, we ought to have one like that here. So we did put together a national program, and that's how it got started.
So over the years, you've provided that convening space, a virtual convening place, but a convening space nonetheless, where an individual can tune in and hear people with whom they agree and hear people with whom they disagree, treated with the same level of respect by the person who hosts that space. Why has that become so much of a more unique phenomena in our society? You touched, before you began to talk about your own program, you touched on the idea that the dramatic increase in the number of media outlets has contributed to that. Anything else that you'd want us to think we ought to be thinking about and why we have such a more difficult time listening to each other?
Well, partisanship has a lot to do with it, I think. And one of the things that I objected to when I was in television as time went on was I did a lot of political reporting, and it seemed to me that more and more what we were all doing was reporting on politics and government as if it was entertainment. And that more and more became the case, it seemed to me. And I found that to be not only unsatisfactory from my point of view, but also, I thought, somewhat damaging. And I think that it has led us to where we are today. I think the politicians fell into it. I think that they started being performers as much as they were governors in the broader sense. And that it was enough for them to get a soundbite and get on the news. They didn't have to do anything. And voters began responding to them more for what they were seeing on the circus-type coverage that we were providing than they were to the issues that they were dealing with. And there became a sort of disconnect between politics and government and the people that are supposed to be governed.
I think you're exactly right, and I'd actually take it a step further. As someone who, as you know, used to work in politics, advising candidates, one of the things I saw as these trends accelerated is for a politician who wanted to advance in his or her career, there was a very straightforward cost-benefit analysis to be made before appearing before the media. And what an entire generation of candidates and politicians learned is after appearing on a talk radio or cable television program, they got relatively few calls or letters or faxes or emails. They got relatively few responses saying, "Gosh, Joe, what a thoughtful trenching point you made on television last night." But when they instead offered a very confrontational, very abrasive, often ugly response, the true believers on their respective side, right or left, cheered them on. And if you are a politician or anyone who wants to succeed, you crave positive feedback. And if the choice is between one or people who say, "Oh my goodness, how thoughtful and how trenchant that was," and hundreds and thousands who said, "Go get him," it's intoxicating. And what you see now is those same politicians knowing that in order to continue to attract that attention and that approval, it's not just enough to be combative and confrontational, but to be the most combative and most confrontational, and so the competition gets that more intense in order to stand out. But I think your base point is exactly the right one.
Well, remember, too, you're hearing from somebody here who was involved in doing this, and it's wonderful to get somebody who is that honest and straightforward about it, and I want to congratulate you for doing it, because people get paid a lot of money for manipulating the media in ways that I'm sure you didn't do. But that's why we get to a situation such as we have now, where there is more dishonesty than there is honesty in the political campaign process. And it just paved the way for Donald Trump, it seems to me, who, of course, was a master of television before he became anything else. I don't know that he's a master of anything else except television, but he knows how to do it. He knows how to be challenging. He knows how to keep the attention focused on him. And if I may reflect on an op-ed piece I recently wrote for the LA Times, what happened last year was that early on in his campaign, before he had really become taken seriously by anybody, CNN, and they have now, the head of CNN has had to admit to this, CNN was running Trump rallies for 15 and 20 uninterrupted minutes at a time, live TV, with Trump not making any news, not saying anything that was in any way significant, but what a showman. And they loved it, and they left him on, and they ran him on and on. They didn't do any commentary. They barely went away to commercials apologetically every once in a while, because that's how they make their money. And of course, their ratings went up, and so did Trump's. And I would say that that is pretty basic to the fact that he is now the president of the United States. He was better at it than Hillary Clinton was.
Well, and this goes, as you pointed out, to something that he learned long before his political career began. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. I like to quote not Donald Trump on this particular matter, but to me the person who's framed this the best is the former basketball player Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman once said, "The only bad press is an obituary." And what he was suggesting, and I think your point about Trump dovetails the same point, is it is better to be the object of controversial and unfavorable attention than it is to receive no attention. And if you go back and read Art of the Deal, Trump makes this case pretty straightforward, not quite as colorfully as Rodman did, but he makes the same point, which is in that hyper-competitive New York City media market, Page 6 and New York One and Howard Stern and all the rest of it, if you get ignored, you don't exist. But he decided it is easier to turn unfavorable attention into favorable attention than it is to turn no attention into some attention. And I think, to your point, Warren, if you doubt that theory, Then ask President Jeb Bush how the alternative goes.
Well, and particularly in this climate where people already were wondering why it was that they weren't getting the services and whatever it was that they expected from the politicians who were playing to the cameras, playing for the drama, without bothering to govern at the same time, creating a real sense and a very legitimate sense of grievance by a lot of people. So all Donald Trump had to do was express that, which of course he did by attacking everybody who came in within sight. And it was very difficult for them to respond.
Well, and of course, in addition to the cable news coverage of his speeches, as you remember, the way the primary debates were set up is the candidates with the highest rankings in the polls were put center stage and given the most time and attention.
Yeah.
So if you are Lindsey Graham, you're way off over there and get to talk once or twice over the course of a couple of hours.
Yeah.
But if you're Trump or Cruz, you're sitting center stage.
And again, it's the media that made those decisions. The Republican Party gave up the opportunity, it seems to me, to be the nominating entity or nominating force. They turned it over to the cable news networks, and they would have those debates, and they'd then take polls as to who did the best, and they'd eliminate one after the other. And again, it had nothing to do with the party. It had nothing to do with the platform, nothing to do with the issues whatsoever. All it had to do was the numbers, the ratings in television, and the public opinion polls. So we got about as far from substantive discussion of government, what it ought to do, how it ought to serve people, as it's possible to get.
And then, of course, when you move from the campaign trail to the Oval Office, the stakes increase considerably. And while a cable news producer or even an other American politician may understand the dynamic even if they're not entirely comfortable with it, the leader of a foreign government might not have that same grounding.
Well, you know a lot about that, I think. And the impression that we're now making on other countries and the notion of American leadership in the world, it seems to me, is eroding, because who could understand this? Nobody can understand it. It doesn't have a rationale. It has a sort of daily hit aspect to it. And we have somebody who, once again, wants to command attention and is able to command attention and will do it for any reason at all, so that there's no coherent policy that we can attribute any longer to the United States. And that is it seems to me, very dangerous situation to find ourselves in.
Well, and what I found instructive in the questions that came from so many of you is while there were questions about Russia and about Iran and about North Korea, there were many, many more about the United States' relationships with its traditional allies, and how this lack of predictability affected those relationships. I guess the question I have, and by the way, I think all of you know, having attended these programs in the past, we work very hard, I work very hard, not to take sides on a partisan basis or other. And I think Warren and I both intend this to be analysis as opposed to taking sides. And so I think it's worth taking a step back and noting that I think what we're talking about is just a new dynamic in American politics and American political conversation. Every single one of you is a highly intelligent person, by virtue of you being here with us, a highly intelligent person who's perfectly capable, without learning from either Warren Olney or Dan Schnur, what to think about these things. And so again, I think it's worth a reminder that we're not here to take sides, but just how to think about such an unusual and a unique dynamic. And so the question I put to you, Warren, as it relates not just to the international stage, but even the ongoing media coverage, is this president, given the dynamic that exists in society and media that you've been talking about, is Donald Trump, in terms of communications, not substance, but in terms of how he communicates, is he an aberration and an outlier, or is he a forerunner?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I know you teach people, young people, and I've addressed a audience that included a lot of people at Santa Monica College the other night, and the question was, what's going to happen to journalism, and where will it go? And I had to say to them that I don't know. And it's going to be up to them to figure out a way to try to maintain the standards of journalism that I grew up with and that I tried to maintain with this extraordinary situation that we have. The media landscape, it appears, isn't going to change very much. And now, of course, we have other ways of manipulating it. So we have the bots, for example, that are the fake news sites that appear to be real news sites. And apparently it's possible to follow them, and they were very much involved in the United States until the election was over, and then they were traced to France when France was having an election, and then they went to Germany when Germany had an election, and once again, when they can appeal to people who feel comfortable with what it is that they're saying, how do you reach those people? If they don't want to know what you are going to tell them, how do you get to them? I don't know the answer to that. So. And you're asking exactly the right question. Does that mean that Donald Trump will be succeeded by another Donald Trump who may have different ideas or different policies or different ways of operating, but essentially do it the same way?
And to me, that's where that's where I think your points get very interesting. As it happens, Trump is certainly not a traditional conservative, but represents a brand of conservatism. The approach that we're talking about, the more confrontational, combative approach, the base motivation as opposed to persuasion, there is nothing uniquely conservative or Republican about that. And a very somebody with very intensely and deep felt progressive values could employ the same techniques on behalf of her or his cause. In my class, you mentioned this earlier. I confessed this to my students. I said, I'm going to use one phrase over and over again this semester, and that phrase is "except for Trump," because I don't know if this is a one-off aberration from a unique candidate, or if this is the future of American politics and political communication. So because I'm old and hidebound, I am going to teach this in the way that I've always seen it done over the years. And if it turns out that the next generation of American political leaders, left and right, conduct themselves in the same way, then I'll revise my syllabus, but you're going to have to drag me to it kicking and screaming.
Well, here's an interesting thing I discovered. I did a panel recently on treason, and partly because it's become a sort of familiar word. You know, we're hearing all about treason. People are accusing each other of treason all the time. And it turns out that it's in fact it's very unlikely that anybody's ever going to be convicted of treason anytime soon, because under the Constitution, the only crime that's specified in the Constitution, and we have to, in order for treason to be possible, we have to be at war. So we're not at war. And yet people are suggesting that maybe Robert Mueller is going to find evidence that there has been treason. Well, that can't be the case. And yet, and we know that Trump and the first general that got canned as the national security advisor, whose name Flynn, accused Hillary Clinton of treason. And what did we find but a soundbite of Hillary Clinton becoming very, very close to accusing Trump of treason with just not using the same word? Well, isn't that really the same thing that Trump is doing? And I think, I haven't read all of her book, but I have heard a lot of what her advisors have had to say and what she's had to say too. And an awful lot of her campaign was based on attacking Trump, not necessarily on issues, not necessarily, and she didn't do much about the economy, didn't offer anybody anything in particular, but attacked Trump. So she began doing the same thing he was doing because it works.
Well, and of course, to fast forward to 2017 on the precipice of 2018, this is a very intense debate going on within the Democratic Party. And you've heard some really smart Democrats, most notably Senator Schumer from New York, but plenty of others as well, saying simply criticizing Donald Trump is not sufficient. Right. People know what they need to know about him. Some think those are good things, some think those are bad things, but we are not going to win. We are not going to win power back simply by criticizing. We need to offer a policy alternative to them. And just as there's a struggle in the Republican Party between, for lack of a better term, an insurgency and the remnants of a party establishment, you're beginning to see the same thing emerge in the Democratic Party as well, aren't you?
Oh, very much. And Dianne Feinstein is being attacked for not attacking Trump enough. And that's true of others, too, who want to have, or say they want to have at least, some kind of bipartisanship or some kind of conversation about, how are we going to solve one problem or another. We do have a few, after all. Some of them are being attacked, just as has been the case in the Republican Party, for not being sufficiently partisan, for what it's worth.
But, and as we shift the conversation further into public policy, it's worth remembering where we started tonight's program, talking about polarization and partisanship. If you live in your own news and information echo chamber, then compromise is unacceptable, whether from the right or the left. And someone like Feinstein, or someone in the Republican Party like, I'll say a Lindsey Graham or a Lamar Alexander, tends to look much more like a relic than the kind of person who can really rally their party to their side.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. Now, how does that manifest itself when it comes to public policy? We're watching debates in Washington over health care, over taxes. Are they just too polarized to get anything done? Or can the right leaders under the right circumstances still pull these disparate strands back together?
Well, as people always say, we have yet to find that out, but we have this bizarre thing that's occurred this week where we have the Senate voting to pass a budget. Well, it's not really a budget. It's a framework for the budget. It's not a detailed spending plan. They didn't vote on how much money is going to go to the Center for the Study of Diseases or whatever, at CDC. They voted for this framework. And the reason they voted for it was that by doing that, they avoid a situation where the Republicans have to tolerate a filibuster by the Democrats if they want to take up the issue of tax cuts or tax reform, whatever they choose to call it. Early in my career, a politician in Sacramento said to me something I will never forget, which is that tax reform is always a cruel hoax because it simply means you're moving the money from one pocket to another. Somebody gains and somebody loses. So tax reform is a nice way of saying that, you win, you lose. In any case, that's what they want to get to, and it's all because they've made promises in the past, just as the situation with health care is concerned. They don't seem to be concerned about the substance of the issue at all, but rather about getting something done. And they may well pass a tax cut that is very damaging to the very people who voted for Donald Trump.
Well, and of course, bypassing a budget that allows the tax cut to pass with 51 rather than 60 votes, it's a tacit admission that bipartisanship is not possible in this climate. And you could make the same point about the vote on Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, or going back a couple of years, the Democrats making a similar decision on other federal court nominations. So here we have in Washington, you still have efforts toward bipartisanship, and a lot of our questioners raised questions about health care. And after two failed efforts on the part of the Republicans to repeal Obamacare, you now have two veteran respected United States senators, one Democrat and one Republican, Patty Murray from Washington State and Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, trying to pass not a repeal of Obamacare, but a fix to make it work more effectively than both would agree that it has. I can tell my students about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan working together to save Social Security. I can tell them about Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton working together on welfare reform and trade. Then I tell them about the butter churn and the 8-track tape player, and that's the end of that conversation. How much does that additional challenge for the political leaders come from the media environment that you talked about. In other words, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill could meet behind closed doors, negotiate back and forth with some confidence that the results of their negotiations would not become public until they were complete. That can't happen in a Twitterverse.
I think that's right, and we've never learned how to do that and enter into those negotiations in a public way. I think you probably have to concede too much because your people are going to rebel against you if they know about it. Well, now we have a situation where they know about it, and if it doesn't leak out of the Trump White House, it leaks out of someplace else. It's amazing what's come out of the Trump White House when you consider that. He complains about leaking, which he ought to do because he's had more leaks than I think any president we've ever heard of. Almost everything he says, it seems to me, is suddenly public information. So even if he wanted it to be bipartisan, it would probably be damaging to him amongst his base, and therefore he can't risk it.
Now, you and I are both old enough to remember a time when this kind of bitter partisanship, as the phrase went, stopped at the water's edge.
That's what they said.
Not so much these days.
No, that's right. Foreign policy was supposed to be strictly bipartisan. I think that was a legacy of World War II. And, that was the good war that everybody was able to support, and we were supposed to have been on the right side of it, and we could all agree on that. Although there was opposition to World War II, there wasn't as much of it as there has been to subsequent wars, or there was to previous ones. So that was a climate where that sort of thing sounded right. And, we could all agree that we wouldn't have partisan arguments about foreign policy. Well, clearly, that's not true anymore, and I think it's partly, too, a function of the global economy. And the fact now that special interests of different kinds have competitive concerns in other countries and with free trade or restricted trade, however you want to describe the current economy.
And of course, I want to ask a question about partisanship on those issues in just a second, but first I want to just remind our audience of those index cards that you have. In about 15 minutes, we're going to ask our team to begin to pick up those cards. So if there are topics that Warren and I have addressed that you'd like to hear another perspective on, if there are things that we have not yet talked about that you'd like to become part of the conversation, we'd ask that you take the next several minutes to write down the questions for us. And then in the last 30 minutes of the program, we'll do everything we can to address as many of those questions as possible. So on this question about partisanship, even in the international arena, the partisan lines were much more predictable. Republicans were more likely to want to engage militarily, Democrats less so. Republicans tend to be stronger supporters of trade, Democrats a little bit less so. Now you've seen an isolationist presence emerge and grow at the base of both parties. Much more concern about trade, much more reluctance in both parties to engage militarily, increasing suspicion, if not downright hostility toward immigration. Generally speaking, throughout American history, when we've started, I was going to say when we've started building walls, but I used to mean that figuratively, so I think I need to find another way of describing it. When these isolationist tendencies grew throughout American history, it was usually in the immediate aftermath of a war or a dramatic economic downturn. And granted, we've had both recently. But what's driving this isolationism? Why are the populist sentiments in this country pulling us back from the rest of the world?
I think it has a lot to do with the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, which leaves more and more people feeling that they're getting left behind and that they're not included in the economy. We're now at a point where the concentration of wealth is almost comparable to what it was in the late 19th century, which it seems to me may well be close to the time when people come to the door with the pitchforks and we really have some problems. Clearly we have sufficient unrest to have elected Donald Trump, who was sounding that theme to the extent that he sounded a coherent theme very, very loudly, more so than anybody ever has before, and people responded to it, even though it wasn't a majority of the voters. So I think that has led to, when I'm not doing well, I have a greater sense of antipathy toward the other. And maybe the other's doing better than I am, or maybe it's just the other. But it does seem to me that follows, that when people have that sense of deprivation, they get hostile about it, and hostile to newcomers, and to people who might be those who are going to come and take away still more. And that's the kind of rhetoric that you hear when you hear immigrants described, even though the record shows that immigration tends to be good for the country, and that immigrants are hardworking, don't commit crimes, and make the country better than it was before.
As former President George W. Bush pointed out in his criticism of an unnamed national political leader in his remarks yesterday.
That's right.
Now, to be fair, this is not by any means a uniquely American phenomenon. We've just seen elections in Austria, in Germany, the Brexit last year in Great Britain. This is a much broader sentiment. This fear, this anguish. If we look at history for lessons on how to address it, are there lessons to be learned?
If there were, I wouldn't be sitting here, and I knew them. I wouldn't be sitting here on this platform. I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
I feel the same way. If it were easy, it would be done.
Yeah.
Some of you may remember that for one of our Chautauqua programs, one of our panelists was a very, very smart man by the name of Roberto Suro, former New York Times and Washington Post reporter, who later went on to be the director of the Pew Hispanic Center. He now teaches at the University of Southern California. And he and I had lunch not too long ago, and we're talking about this topic. And he made what I thought was a really fascinating point. He said there's nothing wrong with nationalism per se. And he said, but I'm not going to talk about good and bad nationalism, or even strong and weak nationalism. I'm going to talk about confident nationalism and insecure nationalism. He said strong nationalism is what we learned when we were growing up as patriotism. A community, whether a city or a state, a country, a people, that was confident enough itself in its capabilities that it welcomed challenges and welcomed competitions because it knew that they could prevail not in a zero-sum game way, but in a way that benefited those who competed. He said the weaker nationalism, the insecure nationalism, is a frightened nationalism, and that becomes isolationism. And he said that's a. I like him.
A wise response.
And this isn't a remedy, but a diagnosis. It's not even mine. But if there were doctors in the room, they would tell you that before you can offer a prescription to an illness, you need to diagnose it. And the best description I've heard of it is from my friend Roberto's, who does draw a distinction characteristic between pride in a community, in a group, in a country, that manifests itself in one way, and insecurity and fear that manifests itself in another. And I know we have just as humans, we have sort of a collective impulse. My former boss, Senator John McCain, talks about being part of a cause greater than your own self-interest. And President Obama makes a very similar point in slightly different ways. But while I wouldn't pretend for a second to have an answer to this any more than you do, I wonder if the answer doesn't come somewhere along that path of identifying commonalities that can make people feel part of a larger whole.
Well, that sounds right. As you were speaking, I was just thinking of nations that have gone from strong nationalism to weak nationalism, or shown the symptoms of doing that. And I found the most surprising one to be Germany, because Germany has been so strong in so many ways now since World War II, and it reacted in such a positive, really sort of magnificent way ultimately after World War II was over, and tried to eliminate the source of that kind of thinking, and what had led to the Holocaust and to World War II itself. And yet now it seems to be caught up in a very similar kind of situation. I don't know the reason for it. I find it disturbing, but again, it's a mystery to me, and I can't tell you why that's happened there.
Well, I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and a group of us had the good fortune not too long ago to have lunch with a member of the German legislative body, of the German Bundestag, who's somebody who was running as part of Merkel's coalition. And he offered almost verbatim the explanation for the political dynamic there that you did just a few minutes ago.
Wow.
Talking about the dynamic in this country, the economic insecurity, the fear of the other. And this was long enough before the election that he was not certain of the outcome. But he said a leader like Angela Merkel tries to remind us the words I used a minute ago, of the benefits of strong and confident nationalism as opposed to...
Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but Germany seemed to me, as I said, I think the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few is a very, very basic problem that we have to deal with. I don't know that that's the case in Germany. The labor unions there are very strong. It's interesting that when there was a vote on the Volkswagen plant in the South, I forget what state it was in, Volkswagen, the company, wanted the union to succeed, but it failed. Why did Volkswagen, the company, want the union to succeed? What does that tell us, I wonder? This is totally without an answer as far as I'm concerned, about what's actually going on in Germany, and is it not the model of capitalism that works, that I at least thought it was.
Let's look ahead for a few minutes before we go to the questions from the smart people in the room. And just as a reminder, we're going to collect those questions in just the next couple of minutes. And so, is our crack team getting ready to head down the aisles and collect? Excellent. So you'll have a chance to hand in those questions in just a moment. Let's look ahead. We are, I hate to be the one to break it to all of you, we are about 10 weeks away from an election year. Yeah, I know. And these midterm elections come with tremendous stakes. You mentioned it, alluded to a Feinstein-De Leon race here in California. But of course, nationally, the midterm elections, like most midterms, are to a large degree a referendum on the sitting president. And at least public opinion polls suggest that what looked like very strong Republican majorities several months ago, both the House and perhaps even the Senate, seem to be in play. As the election year begins to take shape, what are you looking for? What are you watching as you watch the political landscape develop?
Well, it seems to me that the election is the reason that the Republicans are so desperate to be able to say we passed something. It doesn't really seem to matter much what it is. You mentioned the two efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare. Neither one of them would have been a very good plan. And incidentally, it's always worth pointing out that Obamacare originally was designed to help the insurance companies to avoid a single-payer plan. That's where it started out, and that's how it became first Romneycare in Massachusetts, and then later Obamacare, although, of course, then it got tagged with a Democratic label, and they decided they didn't like it. I don't think it really had much to do with the system itself at all. I think it had all to do with partisanship. So they want to pass something and be able to call it an accomplishment. And Trump, they call it Trump's plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. It wasn't really Trump's plan. The same thing with this tax cut or tax reform plan. I don't think it comes from him very much. It comes from Paul Ryan, comes from other places. They don't care. They just want to be able to say they've done something. So what I'm looking for is the Republicans, the Democrats rather, to see if they can come up with something substantive and try to reach people with more than just a label. And I don't see at the moment the Democrats showing a lot of ability to do that, but of course they're just getting underway. They're just still recovering from what was a terrible shock. They never thought they were going to lose to the presidential election, and yet they did. So they're rattling around in their closets at this point, trying to figure out what to do and how to get out the door. And we'll have to see.
What is interesting to me, and we talked about this just very briefly earlier, is what is still, at least ostensibly, a two-party system. Both major parties have at least two parties within, an insurgent and an establishment party. You see Mr. Bannon out recruiting challengers to the Republican establishment, but you see any number of more progressive Democrats than we've seen in many years occupying positions of power, looking to storm the gates of their party's establishment also.
I just have to interrupt you. You mentioned Bannon. We did a program today on Bannon and what he's doing, and particularly what he's doing in Alabama, where he has come to the support of former Judge Roy Moore, who was twice thrown out of his job as Chief Justice of the state of Alabama because he basically disobeyed the law, and the courts ejected him. First, it was the U.S. Supreme Court, and then he got kicked out again. So, and he's such an extremist that it's hard to imagine him in the U.S. Senate, even though we have plenty of extremists there already. And yet, we don't have the so-called establishment senators saying, wait a minute, we don't want this guy in the Senate, because then they would have to say, well, the Democrat who's running against him would be preferable. We had a woman on from Dallas who is, in fact, a lifelong Democrat who has been trying to drum up support for the Democrat and saying that we simply can't get any worse than we already are, and it would be better to have a Democrat if we had to.
Just to interrupt you there, that sentiment, where things can't get any worse, that we can't get any worse than they already are, seems to me like a really risky sentiment to be articulating out loud.
Of course it is. Oh, sure it is. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
very risky.
You were making a broader point.
Well, no. I'm just saying that when Bannon is recruiting these people who are wildly extreme and in many ways, they don't represent anything positive. It's a negative movement, if you will, if it is a movement. We don't really know. We don't know how good Bannon is at it, but he's got a lot of money behind him. He's got the Koch brothers, and he's got the Mercer family, and he's liable to be able to make some waves. And if those people get into the Senate, things are going to really change.
Well, and
the party's going to change.
In this spring, different people are going to come to different conclusions about two parties and two insurgencies. But once again, this brings us back full circle to the conversation we're having about media. The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a famous saying, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. In 21st century America, when everyone has their own Facebook page and their own YouTube channel, which means by definition everyone has their own media channel, in 2017 we are entitled to our own facts, aren't we?
Yeah, well, we insist on our own facts. Whether we're entitled to them or not, I don't know. The question becomes then, what standard do you use? And if you don't all use the same standard, then how do you have bipartisanship? How can you possibly work together and get along and try to solve the same problems and come to a solution that's going to make everybody happy?
So the question, though, that this leads to, and I wouldn't pretend for a moment to know the answer, but I know you will, no pressure, is a question of numbers. Are we as a society becoming more and more polarized and more extreme and more intolerant? Or are the most extreme voices just becoming louder because they've been given the tools to make more noise?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I can only hope that the answer is the latter rather than the former, but I don't know. We'll have to see. One election coming up.
Are there, and this is not a partisan or ideological statement, so it's a question less based on positions on the issues than just the makeup of the individuals themselves. Having interviewed just about every prominent political leader in the state of California over the course of your career, and any number of prominent political leaders of both parties at the national level, who do you admire?
That's not a fair question. I'm
sorry.
sorry.
And I'm not asking for a vote or support. For all I know, if you decide you want to answer this question, you might vehemently disagree with one or more of the people on the issues. Another way of asking it, for someone who gets to question these people, is what helps you decide in conversation with them whether they're worthy of your admiration or not? What kind of qualities do you look for when you're talking to someone?
Well, I look for people who are thoughtful enough that the political statements they make are based on some sort of syllogistic process that starts with a fact that I'm concerned about. I guess what I respect the most in a politician is concern for other people, and concern for the polity at large, and for the society. So often they represent only special interests or their own interest, whether they want to run for the next office because they're termed out. I'm awfully sorry about term limits, or whether they're essentially getting paid to represent somebody else. I look for people who aren't doing that. They're harder and harder to find, quite frankly, because it's so expensive to run for office. Even you find that people you really want to have respect for, over here they have a weakness, at least in my estimation, which is that they're too dependent on a particular interest, and that they will pursue that interest regardless of what it means for everybody else. So if I can dodge the question artfully enough, that's the way I would do it.
I would say that if you're going to dodge the question, you might as well dodge it that eloquently. That was phenomenal. But I'm going to pick up on something that you said, because I think it was a particularly important point, and I want to make sure we caught it. You talked about political leaders who care about people, and what I noticed that you didn't do is offer a definition on the best way to demonstrate that you care about people. Some will say that is best done by a more intense and a more enhanced role for government. Others would say that you can demonstrate that care through the private sector, for charity, or through philanthropy. And what I noticed in your answer, if you intended that way, was that it wasn't about choosing partisan or ideological sides, but rather, if there is a principled conservative who says the best way to confront that challenge is through a community and through charity and philanthropy, and an equally principled progressive who says no, the government must play a more outsized role in this process, it sounds to me like both are should be equally worthy of our admiration.
My wife, who is the wisest person I know, and not just because she's in the audience, but because she helps me more than any other person ever has, says that political science is an oxymoron and a contradiction. And I think she's right. And I've never bought the idea that any of these, whatever you call them, the basics of the partisan advocacy is as good as a practical solution to a given problem, whether it seems to be consistent with your so-called political theory or not. I just want to see people get healthy, be able to go to work in the morning and do their jobs and be adequately compensated and have good health. And it seems to me that's what our politicians ought to be doing as well, even if they have to discard from time to time the philosophy of the party, whatever the party is.
Well, I think it raises the important point, as we discussed earlier, about bipartisanship, but also practicality.
Yeah.
There's a famous story about Lyndon Johnson after his first cabinet meeting with the Kennedy cabinet in early 1961, goes out for dinner with his buddy Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House. And LBJ is going on and on about how brilliant they are, and this one's amazing, and this one's incredible, and this one's extraordinary. And Rayburn sits and listens, and after a little while he goes, well, Lyndon, maybe so, but I'd feel a lot better if just one of them had run for county sheriff just once. And I think you're right. Someone who can come to the kind of principle you're talking about by having gotten their hands dirty and seen for themselves, not just in theory but in practice, whether something can work, and not being a slave to the ideology, I think is a really important point.
I can't help but say that when you mentioned Sam Rayburn, that as it happens, when Sam Rayburn died, I was working at the Library of Congress and writing speeches and other things for members of Congress, whatever party they were in. They would send some subject over and we would write it up. And I wrote 13 eulogies to the memory of Sam Rayburn. So it wasn't an easy thing to do.
All right, well, we have two options at this point. One is for me to offend the overwhelming majority of people who've handed in questions because we're not going to be able to ask them all. The other is just to stay till breakfast. So we'll take a vote in about 15 minutes or so, but in the meantime, I'd say for everyone to get comfortable. I'm going to start out by asking what looks like a tremendous question. And this goes back to our discussion about nationalism a little bit earlier. What is your definition of healthy patriotism?
I think I've already given it. I think it's not my country right or wrong. I think it's my country do the best for as many people as it's possible to do, and cooperate with others around the world.
So let's go from the uplifting to the very nuts and bolts. We talked a little bit earlier about the dynamic in last year's presidential election. The question was, did Hillary Clinton not talk about the issues, or were they simply not covered in the media?
That's a very good question, and I think probably the answer is yes to both. Because the media had an opportunity to force her to talk about issues. We always do have that opportunity. We don't do it enough. And I think that's one of the failings of the national media in particular, that they become stenographers and just simply report what people are saying rather than raising issues and trying to make them accountable for themselves and to explain how it is that they're going to accomplish the things that they claim they want to accomplish. I think it works both ways, and give her points for the fact that she might have had no choice in the matter except to attack Donald Trump, which is basically what she did. But she too could have taken a different point of view, whether the media would have, not point of view, but a different strategy. Whether the media would have picked up on it or not, I don't know. I think she spent a lot of time writing about that in her book.
Well, I think that's right. I'll offer an additional thought as a former practitioner. I don't think I ever manipulated the news media, but sure tried. But I'll offer you this theory. I think most voters do care about the issues, and I think most voters ultimately make their decision based on the issues. Not all equal, but the issues that are most important to them. Voters don't say, I agree with this candidate on 11 issues and that candidate on 6. They pick out the ones that really are most important to them at their core. But I think they view those issues through the prism of the candidate, of the man or woman. Healthcare is the most important issue to me. Immigration is the most important issue to me. Tax policy is the most important to me. But in addition to the candidate's position on the issues, do I have enough confidence and trust and faith in that candidate to carry out policies on the issues that are most important to me? And Hillary Clinton, I don't think through any fault of her own, just a brilliant woman. I think the consequence of decades in the public eye and the understandable defensiveness that any human being would have developed under that kind of scrutiny and that kind of criticism over that kind of time, got to a point where she simply wasn't able to demonstrate enough of herself to provide a platform for those issues. So talking about the issues is critically important. But I think the voters have to have a level of confidence in the individual, herself or himself, to carry out those issues. And I believe that Clinton, by virtue of what she'd gone through over the course of her career, simply wasn't able to open herself to the point where she could demonstrate those qualities.
Well, that may be, and obviously she had many years to develop habits of speech and ways of coping and so on that may have done her wrong. I would take issue with you to a certain extent with regard to whether people vote for issues or and for candidates because they think the candidate has the best opportunity of making good on the issue. This is not a policy matter, but there's a fascinating, a couple of graphs that appeared in the New York Times having to do with the National Football League. And we had National Football League, Trump voters, loving the National Football League until the issue of Kaepernick and standing for the national anthem came about, when it goes like that. And we have Democratic voters feeling about the National Football League go up, and they cross in a very dramatic way. So it seems to me that certainly as far as the Trump supporters are concerned, it's because Trump said he didn't like the football league anymore that they changed their views on that. And I think there have been other issues. I can't think of one offhand, but there have been other issues where he's gone back and forth, and the voters have gone back and forth with him. Even though he contradicts himself, they contradict themselves too and follow along.
Well, I'll only offer this, and then we'll go on because we have quite a few more to do. I don't like to make predictions, and it's not because I think they're silly or shallow or superficial. It's because I'm usually wrong. But I will make the following prediction. I will bet you that a minuscule number of voters will cast their ballot next year on the National Football League and whether players.
I couldn't agree with you more on that.
Okay. So sticking with the 2016 campaign, there seems to be an appetite in the room for revisiting it. Do you think that Barack Obama could have defeated Trump had he been the Democratic nominee in 2016?
Yeah.
Okay. I agree, and I would add this. I think the candidate, the Democratic candidate that would have won the race, and very, very persuasively, is not President Obama, although I agree with you, I think he may have won, as Vice President Biden.
Yeah, I agree.
And if you look at the working class voting cohort that was the key to Trump's success, Uncle Joe from Scranton, PA, might have had a real ability to reach out to those voters in a way that many Democrats have struggled with in recent years.
Yeah. And he would have been, I think, let us not forget that Hillary Clinton was a woman. And we have never had a woman president. We've had a black president. We've never had a woman president. And, that may well have had a major impact on a lot of voters.
Okay, changing fields dramatically, and this is a tremendous question, so whoever asked it, kudos to you. We were talking about fear earlier, and we were talking primarily about economic fear. Well, obviously other things engender fear also, and this question asks, do you think that the fear that has been inspired by Islamic extremism has caused greater fear of immigration?
Well, it's certainly been used to oppose immigration, and frankly, I think it's been wildly exaggerated. Of course, we had 9/11, which was extraordinarily dramatic, but in terms of loss of life, nothing compared to gun accidents, for example, or suicides, or death by opioid poisoning. And it seems to me that it has been, to say the least, overstated. It's certainly a problem in other places, but whether it's a real serious problem here in the United States, I have real question about.
Well, and of course, there's two levels to that question. One is the degree to which it is a serious and substantive problem to be confronted, and the other is whether the fear that the prospect of that threat leads to a certain set of political decisions. I will just say this. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain. Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And the question, and again, I think for people who are frightened, the idea that someone coming here from another country might be a terrorist, I can see how that would frighten them. But I have ancestors, who never made it to this country. In the 1930s and 40s, the term of art was not terrorist, it was spy. And there were a lot of people who wanted to come to this country several decades ago who were not allowed in because of fears that they might be Nazi or communist spies. And that's not me arguing for open borders. I'm just saying that these kind of fears can drive voters' opinion in a really difficult way. And without taking sides in the immigration policy debate, I'm more than happy to do that after we put down the microphones, but not up here. For someone who wants to use that fear to move public opinion, it's a pretty tempting prospect.
Well, fear is a great political weapon. There's no question about it, and people respond to it to an extraordinary degree. But as far as Islam is concerned, it seems to me that the fear or the fact of discrimination and against and repression of Muslims in this country is a greater problem than we have to fear from Islamic terrorism.
Shifting areas again pretty dramatically, but again, just a tremendous number of excellent questions here. What can we do to get a much greater level of voter turnout?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. It's funny, when I first came here, it was 1972, I got here, and I was a political editor at Channel 2. Channel 2 at the time had a big audience, and I remember on an election day, I went on the air and said, you got to vote, and it's very important, and you use your franchise, and we're one of the few countries in the world where you can do it, and so on and so forth, and all the standard arguments. And at that time, we got cards and letters. We didn't get emails. And I got one from a Republican political consultant who said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard anybody say, because you're telling people to come and vote even though they don't know what they're doing. So, do we really want to have more people voting? Yes, of course we do, but we would hope that they would do it because they care about the results and have some sense that they can affect them.
Well, and I think you've just drawn a really important distinction here. On one hand, two great obstacles to greater levels of voting. One is convenience, and the other is motivation. And you can make it more convenient to vote in all sorts of ways. Mail voting, online voting.
Weekend or voting,
Exactly.
Why do we have to have it on a Tuesday?
Right, and I don't disagree for a moment. I agree wholeheartedly with making voting more convenient. Yeah. But to me, the core question is one of motivation.
Sure.
You can lead a voter to water, but you can't make them vote.
Can't make them vote right.
Exactly. Well, at all. we've talked about this in this forum before, and I think there are many of us here who've talked more informally about doing a program in the future about the role of our public education system in this regard. I think it's instructive that most California schools, public schools, require a student to take one single semester of civics before they're granted a diploma. And of course, if you look a little bit more carefully, that's 15 weeks of civics and American government and geography all crammed in to one semester, and it is almost always offered in 11th or 12th grade. And I worry that the lesson that we're teaching our young people, even those who might be civically inclined, who volunteer in our communities at commendable levels, are taught that this political stuff, this government stuff, this democracy stuff is so unimportant, we're not going to bother teaching it to you for your first 10 years of school. And then we want you to turn around 18 months later and be responsible citizens and voters.
I think you're absolutely right. And when you look at 5-year-olds with smartphones, it seems to me that we should start teaching media literacy in elementary school.
Exactly. I read one last question before we get to it. I read a great article not too long ago. In 2017, people ask me, well, where did you read this article? And I just say, on my phone. I don't remember. And the article said, this is about the 10th anniversary of the iPhone, which of course we've just celebrated. Okay. Said, if we had told you 10 years ago that most American voters would walk around carrying with them every vote, every issue position, every speech that every candidate for every office had ever taken, we'd think, holy smokes, we'll have the most well-informed and well-prepared electorate in the history of the world. Well, it hasn't worked out quite that way, has it? But that leads into the last question. In your opinion, Warren, is it possible, this is in the media context, is it possible to return to a substantive issue-driven discussion of the type that you discussed earlier? If so, how? And what I'll add is this seems like an excellent opportunity, Warren, for you to talk about your move toward podcasting and what you hope to accomplish on this platform that's different from what you've accomplished on the past platforms from which you've broadcast.
Well, thanks for asking the question. I like doing my program, and I have mixed feelings about giving it up, quite frankly. I'm interested in podcasting because it's a different technology. I've done television, I've done radio, and radio in the era of electronic communications. Podcasting is quite a different matter. It apparently it attracts people for different reasons. They don't just turn you on; they seek you out. So you really have to have something that's worth being sought out. It's much more intimate, and people expect to be talked to sort of on a one-on-one basis rather than on a basis of talking to a mass audience, which of course you really get used to when you're in television, for example. It's of course also true in radio, but you don't see it in the way that you do on television, or people don't see you. What I'm looking forward to in podcasting is there's a kind of freedom about it. I'm not governed by the clock. I don't have to say, I'm sorry, we don't have enough time to ask that or deal with that extraordinarily important issue you just brought up. I can say, wow, that's pretty interesting. Let's explore that. So I'm looking forward to that very much, hoping that listeners will hang in there and stick around. And also you can edit. So if you find that you have a period there, and this happens sometimes on the radio, it happens on any live medium, all of a sudden you get into the weeds, or you sort of lose the train, or and you can sort of hear the people changing the station. And with podcasting, you don't have to do that. You can just cut it out, and go on to the good stuff. So I'm very much looking forward to that. What I'm really looking forward to is that I won't have to get up at 5 o'clock every morning. That's it.
Well, and what I hear you saying from the listener's perspective is even if this will obviously be the best podcast available to us as it relates to current events and public affairs, it's not the only. And we talked about the downside of this early, about the preponderance of media platforms, and there is a downside to that, of course, because it leads to isolation. But there's an upside too. If everybody, if a range of different people get interested, get enthused, get motivated by a range of different things, if I can listen to Warren's podcast and hear in great depth and great detail about an issue that's of great importance to me, and Tom Lochtel can tune into another podcast to hear about something that's just as interesting, just as exciting to him, maybe we're both going to devote more time to making ourselves available to those type of conversations than we would if it was a lowest common denominator type of discussion that was trying to reach everybody all at once. What that does, of course, is it shifts the responsibility. It shifts the responsibility from Walter Cronkite and from David Brinkley and from Tom Brokaw and from Peter Jennings and from Warren Olney to each of us. Because it means if we choose our venue, if we choose our conversation, it really is easy to isolate ourselves. But if we have the wherewithal, and going back to what we talked about earlier, the self-confidence to expose ourselves to conversations with people who we know are more likely to disagree than agree, then not only are we more engaged and listening more carefully, but we're making ourselves part of a broader range of conversations. I've told some of you this before. The last assignment that I give my students at the end of every semester, I tell them I'm going to give you one last assignment. It's not graded, but it's the most important assignment I'm going to give you. That's this. I want every principled conservative in this room to watch Rachel Maddow at least once a week. And I want every principled progressive in this room to read George Will or Charles Krauthammer or David Brooks once a week. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not even trying to open it. I'm just trying to remind you that there's really, really smart people on the other side. And if you're willing to listen to them, you might not be convinced by them that they were right and you're wrong, but it's a lot easier to negotiate with and compromise with and engage in conversation and coexist with someone with whom you disagree if you're willing to listen to what they have to say and they're willing to listen to what you have to say. And to me, that once again, to come back full circle, that's the strength of what you do here. That's the strength of Chautauqua. That's the strength of the Ojai community, that you guys are willing to come together. This was a different type of conversation today between two people who probably didn't disagree all that much, at least not publicly. A little bit of a dust-up could have gotten good on the NFL national anthem thing, but we called it off. But when we do this in a more conventional setting, the fact that so many of you come here knowing that you are going to hear things, both that you agree with strongly and disagree with vehemently, that's the strength of a community. And once again, I'd ask you to close where we opened by giving yourselves a round of applause. We're just at 9 o'clock, and we're going to ask our friend Andy to retake the stage.
Thank you. That was very short. And we wish it could be double the amount of time, and I want to tell you all that we are going to lobby hard to have Warren back for another panel. So you know that our mission is to bring the community together around controversial and highly passionate subjects. And this is our 10th panel, believe it or not, and we hope that each one is getting better than the last. This is a fundraiser. We're raising money. It costs much more money to put these on than the ticket sales can yield. And we want the Ojai Chautauqua to become an essential part of when people come to Ojai or think about Ojai, they think of the Ojai Chautauqua like they think of the music festival or anything else. But we need you to help us do that. We can't do it by ourselves. So your packets that you have there, you'll see they talk about the history of the Chautauqua movement, the Chautauquas that have happened so far and what's coming, also about the Agora Foundation, which is part of that. So I hope that you will consider If you look on the back page of that packet, you'll see that there's a list of people, and that list is growing, who are helping to contribute to this cause so that we can have these and have scholarships for teachers and students. It's something we really care about. November 19th, we are going to have a panel on Ojai tourism, which is the biggest issue in our valley right now, as you know. And we're going to do our best to represent all the sides of that issue. And we're working hard on that, and we hope to see you here. And we think we might need a different venue because we're going to get the whole town out, so we're going to do that. But I want to thank you very much. And Dan and Cecile, truly, you've raised this Ojai Chautauqua to such a high level. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you all coming out here on a Friday night. Good night. Be careful outside. The light's on now, thank goodness. But please be careful. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.